Somananda, what are the key steps to unlocking somebody's personal development and spirituality?
Well, when a person wants to develop spiritually, there's many things that one can do. But what I would advise, if I want to help a person to take some proper steps in that direction, is to start working with their minds properly. And to do that, there are two things which are very useful, and that is, one, learning how to concentrate and to work with the mind, to develop the mind's power. And the second thing would be to learn to practice meditation. So I'll just mention a few basic steps which can be very useful for everyone. First of all, learning to concentrate the mind. We need to understand that our mind has a very great potential, but in order to use it, we need to concentrate it. Concentrating the mind means to learn how to keep the attention of the mind on a certain chosen object. It could be external or internal, like a chakra or an organ in the body, or focusing on a certain external object, and learning to keep the concentration on that object and not allowing the mind to waver or to jump anywhere else. That is quite a challenge. And that's why the simplest thing to do is simply to choose any object, like you can choose a flower, or you can choose, I don't know, a teaspoon, you can choose whatever, and simply look at that and try to observe your mind while you're simply having a very steady gaze on that object. And as you're looking at the object, try to observe and see, how is my mind behaving? Because usually most objects are not that fascinating unless you're looking at a screen of your laptop, which I don't recommend to use for this. So if you just look at an inanimate object of this kind, you'll notice that the mind starts immediately doing all kinds of association. Like you look at the teaspoon and you're thinking teaspoon, ice cream, chocolate ice cream, and the mind jumps in any direction. And what you need to do is bring your mind back to that object every single time. So in the beginning, it's a bit of a Sisyphus type of work, you know. It's a work by which you really need to have a lot of persistence, and it comes usually as a very boring experience. So actually, concentration of the mind in the beginning is not a very glorious practice. It's simply tedious work of bringing the mind back to your object 1,000,000 times if necessary. And that's why a lot of people don't progress with concentration, because they give up. The mind gives them reasons not to do it. So try to do that. Just choose any object. The more simple, the better. Look at it and observe your mind. And as time goes by, the more you do that, you'll notice that the mind will jump less. After some time, it will be like if usually you practice for 10, 20 minutes a day, and your mind jumps around 100 times. After a practice of a few weeks, your mind will jump around 50 times or less. And slowly, slowly, the mind will learn not to jump around. That's the first step. It's a very simple exercise of concentration, just observing your own mind while concentrating on a certain chosen object, and that in itself can take you very far. Hand in hand or in parallel with such a practice, you can also practice some basic form of meditation. And that would be more of an internal practice, where you sit comfortably. The most important thing is to keep the spine straight. But you can sit on a chair, on the ground, whatever. Keeping the spine straight, close the eyes, and simply again, turn your gaze internally. Not physically, but your attention internally. And try to observe what's going on in your body. Try to observe your breathing. Try to do like a sum up, like a report of everything you're experiencing, including what the mind is producing at that time. And the mind will produce all kinds of thoughts. Again, the mind will jump around. And as you're doing that, try to observe your mind and its movement, and simply keep your awareness on your own mind. It sounds, again, a bit strange, but it's very interesting practice to do. How many of us actually go through life without even noticing or observing our own mind? The mind has free range to go around and do whatever it wants, and there's nothing to monitor it. The funny thing is that when we do this simple meditation exercise, we're using the power of our mind to control the mind itself. It's as if the mind is looking at itself. So try to do that. Observe your own thoughts, your own mind, your own feelings, your own tendencies, and just observe it for as long as you can. So if you do the concentration on an external object for 10, 15 minutes a day, meditation of this simple form for 10, 15 minutes a day, that's a half-hour practice a day, which can already bring very wonderful results. It's very simple, it's not difficult, and yet it's very effective, and it's a very good preparation for any of the more advanced practices that we teach in our courses that comes later on.
What are the main challenges that a beginner could expect?
Well, a beginner will always encounter very similar challenges. This is very well known in the yogic tradition. In the yoga tradition, they say that when a person starts practicing concentration of the mind and meditation, they will notice that, first of all, their own mind will fight them. Because the mind have had decades, probably in most cases, where the human being was just totally in the hands of their own mind. The emotions were running wild. The mind were jumping from one thing to the next. And basically the mind had freedom, basically, to do whatever it wants. And now when we start doing these simple exercises, we'll notice that our own minds are not very happy with it, because the mind simply feels like it's restricted suddenly. Of course, for us, it's not that, because you restrict the mind only in the sense that you concentrate it. Just like you concentrate a beam of light until it becomes laser, and then it can do amazing things. In the same way, when you concentrate the mind, it can become much more powerful. But the mind doesn't know that. And the mind feels restricted. It feels unhappy, like a spoiled child. And that's why the beginning obstacle is always the same, and that is that people feel bored. Boredom is a clear example that the mind is trying to take you away from the exercise. The second obstacle that we encounter is that the mind produces anger. And the idea behind it is that the mind knows that if we get agitated, angry, and upset about the practice, we will drop it. And that's another trick, if you might want to call it that the mind does in order to allow itself to go back to its natural way of behaving. And that's why the practitioner must not allow the anger to challenge themselves or to take them away from the practice. So those are the first two very classic challenges that you will notice. The mind may produce other challenges there, like suddenly getting you to remember that you need to do other things, or push you to realize that your body is not healthy or something and you should stop your practice. And all kinds of excuses can miraculously show up in order to put you away from your practice. So the whole point here comes down to one simple thing: determination and not giving up, continuing no matter what happens. So that's the best advice when you encounter these challenges as you start practicing concentration and meditation.
Is there anything additional that the students can look to do whilst they're practicing on their own that's additional support?
Well, there are a few things that you can add. One of the important things which can be very useful is actually making sure that you have a good diet. Food is not just a minor thing. The yogis actually dedicate in all the yoga texts, or most of them, some part of the teaching is regarding food. The yogis explain that food doesn't only feed the tissues of the body, but food actually has a subtle part to it, which feeds the mind. And therefore, funny enough, the food that we eat can determine what kind of thoughts, tendencies, and general mental fluctuations we may experience. And that's why, for example, eating food which is extremely low grade, like fast food, will generate very heavy thoughts, what we would call inert thoughts, dark thoughts, sluggish way of thinking. And as you can imagine, that's not very contributing or helpful when you try to practice concentration and meditation. Other things, for example, is trying to avoid food which is extremely spicy or simply aggressive, like some foods which are like too much spicy Indian or Asian food, or simply eating food which has very low-grade ingredients, which will cause maybe not so much heaviness, but on the other hand can cause a lot of agitation for the mind. And then the mind becomes much more agitated than normal, and then when you try to meditate again, the problems are similar. Maybe you're not so heavy, but you're just all over the place, a space cake, so to speak, and it's very hard to bring the mind to the concentration point. So what should we eat? That's what people would ask. Okay, so what should I eat? Food which is as close to natural as possible. Organic, healthy, simple food. The food can be cooked if necessary. It doesn't have to be only raw food. But of course, raw food can also be useful. The food should be by no means processed and fast food. That's the worst kind. And if possible, the food should include very high quality ingredients. And if you cook your own food, that will be one of the best ways. If you can cook, or prepare at least your own food, that would be best. And not rely so much on ready-made food from the outside. As much as it might sound superficial, it's just food, what's the big deal? Actually, it has a very big impact, not only on our health, but actually on the way the mind works. So that's a very good support to our meditation and concentration practice. Other things that would be done that can support is simply to also modify your mental diet. Instead of only taking care of your physical diet, which is obvious, the mind also absorbs a lot. Just like you don't want to feed your body with junk food, you don't want to feed your mind with junk, mental junk. Like, for example, sitting and watching all kind of horror movies, or sitting hours and hours and playing mind-numbing video games, or doing any other activities, reading fashion magazines all day, or just surfing the internet and Facebooking all day. Instead of allowing the mind to just go into these very not constructive patterns, feed your mind, so to speak, with very healthy thoughts, such as listening to very high quality music, classical music or spiritual music, trying to read spiritual texts, trying to sit and discuss things with people who are also spiritual, because it's very easy to just chit-chat and do, low-grade talking, which is leading to nothing. It's just, gossiping. Instead of gossiping, sit and talk about spiritual truth. Sit and talk about the dreams. Why are we here on this planet? What is the purpose of my life? What did great yogis do in the past? Let's talk about great things, wonderful things. And by doing that, the mind is inspired. Instead of feeling low grade and taking upon garbage that we have to process all the time and deal with, because the mind has to clean itself from the garbage that we put in. Instead, we feed it with high-quality thoughts, high-quality mental diet, so to speak. Combine the physical diet with the mental diet of a high quality, your meditation and concentration already will benefit a lot.
Are there some absolute no-nos?
Of course, there are certain things which are absolutely not recommended. Number one would be violence. Any violent actions in life, violent way of thinking, violent way of behaving even verbally with people is extremely damaging for the mind. Many people think being non-violent is good because you don't hurt other people. That's true, no doubt. But it's much deeper than that. Being non-violent actually doesn't hurt you. Because when a person is behaving violently, even if we think we are the coolest person on the planet and nothing bothers me and I had to do this violence or whatever, actually behaving violently leaves marks in the subconscious mind. And as a result of that, when I try to do spiritual practice, it will be extremely difficult for a violent person. So the number one thing is avoid any form of violence in your life. Mental, verbal, physical, obviously, or any other. And by doing that, you have a better chance of succeeding. That's why in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, when he speaks about the first steps of yoga, the first one is called the yamas, and there are 5 yamas. The first one of all is non-violence. That's where it all starts from.